Surely, Peter. And again, Lewis has been brilliant, right? He's remembering who he is. So for me to be critical of him is almost disingenuous. But
Mm.
I said this at Monaco, and I'm going to repeat the sentiment at Silverstone. Sometimes, doesn't a driver like George did, who was like, mate, track position is key here, and who knows how long this safety car is going to go for. Sometimes, doesn't Lewis want to just overtype, just exercise a veto and say, you know, what are you not talking about? This is a safety car circumstance. I could get a cheeky P2 here if it goes on for as long as I think it might, and just completely unplug the radio and just go about his own business. Has Lewis got some corn to hold there, or is he being a good corporate citizen by just abiding the instructions of Santi and Scuderia Ferrari?
Uh, I mean, he's gelled pretty well with his side of the garage and his new engineer and all that stuff. So that's, I don't think he wants to go too far away from what they're basically suggesting he does. And in order to have concluded that it was worth taking the risk to disobey team orders and stay out, he would have to have known that George had his puncture 8 laps into his hard tire stint and had come in and was on old mediums for that time. And to get all that sort of information to Lewis in the middle of the race, not easy, bearing in mind the level of communication they have. And I was listening quite a lot to Lewis yesterday, and on 3 occasions, his engineer said to Lewis, tire update," and there was just radio silence, nothing. And then there was during the very brief VSC when an umbrella, I think, blew into the sand trap. Can only happen in England. Usually the rain causing it, but
Yeah.
not on this occasion. And and at that point, Lewis said, terrible understeer, car won't turn. And a few laps later, then they say, right, box, new tires. And he says, the tires are perfect. And then still boxes. I mean, when you've got communication going on like that, and at the same time, you've got the Ferrari not telling him that he's got a 5-second penalty for the jump start until he gets to the pit box. What was that all about? I mean, this is how fragile, obviously, the communication with Lewis is these days. What to say to him, what not to say to him, what to get the best from him. You know, Freddie maybe saying, "Oh, back in the Formula 3 days, if he got a penalty, we never told him because he always drove better," or whatever they're thinking. You know, to me, as I said in the video last night, you know, the drivers I work with, all of them want as much information as they can have, providing you give it to them the right way. In other words, at the right point of the track or whatever on a pit, whatever it was in those days. But you know, if Lewis has got a 5-second penalty, I can't think of an argument of why it wouldn't be good to let him know that as soon as possible, because then in his own mind, he can start to think about how he wants to drive the race. They may think, oh, if he told Lewis that, he's going to start talking on the radio for 5 minutes about how he didn't deserve the penalty and he's going to lose concentration and not be very quick. Well, that doesn't give you, that's not much confidence in your driver, is it? And you talk that through with him before he gets in the race car anyway, you know, what sort of thing. Maybe they have talked it through. Maybe Lewis said, oh, if I ever get a penalty, I don't want to hear about it. Maybe he said that. I'd be surprised, but maybe he has. But anyway, the point I'm making is I don't think the communication between Lewis and his engineer, I think as good a job as they're doing together, I don't think the communication is such that Lewis is in a position really to make calls against their recommendation based on gut feel. Because what is his gut feel if he doesn't have enough information about what everybody else is doing anyway? I'm sorry to be slightly complicated in your answer, but I think you understand where I'm coming from.
Hmm. It is a bit complicated over there. I'd argue that potentially Ferrari want to put all of their eggs in the Lewis Hamilton basket if they harbour aspirations of winning a championship. And then we get to Silverstone, a track around which Lewis Hamilton has always been like fantastic. And Charles Leclerc apparently remembers who he is. He stops trying to look at Lewis Hamilton's telemetry and invests in his own driving style, doesn't want to mimic how aggressive Lewis has been on the brakes of late, and starts remembering who Charles Leclerc is. If you had to pick a driver, Peter, between Lewis and Charles, who's going to score, who's going to finish highest on the driver standings in 2026, who have you got?
Well, you have asked me that question before, Cameron. You phrased it slightly differently. But my response is always the same. If Ferrari have a car capable of winning the world championship, and I've said this from the start of the year, even when Charles was in trouble, I think that driver will be Charles. I think over a season, he will outpoint Lewis Hamilton. Now, you began your question to me by saying it looked like, the best thing for Ferrari would be to favor, I think I actually used the word favor, I think it was Lewis. Well, I think the premise there is wrong, because I don't think any team favors a driver in the way that a lot of the media and the ecosystem wants a driver to be favored. It doesn't happen. And lots of drivers who aren't going well, who are not winning, like to persuade through hidden persuasion the ecosystem that it is happening, but it isn't happening. There isn't a moment at Ferrari, in my opinion, when they would have been saying, Lewis, he's won Spain now. We're really going to focus on Lewis now. The implication being we're not going to focus on Charles anymore. I mean, that just doesn't happen. You have Charles Leclerc, who's quite capable of winning Grand Prix and the World Championship. You got Lewis Hamilton, who's quite capable of winning Grand Prix and the World Championship. And if you've got a World Championship winning car, they're both going to be in good shape. And that's it. And you just work flat out in the way you've got your organogram set up for the team. So there is none of that favoring stuff. In terms of Silverstone, I mean, for me, the Charles rebirth did begin in Barcelona in the race. I think he found a rhythm in the race when you've just by definition got to get out there and make the car work. And he had a few iffy moments, but in the race he got into a reasonable rhythm, and he wasn't that slow relative to Lewis. He was doing quite a good job. Then he got to Austria, which I always predicted would be a complicated, difficult race for Charles, because it's a street fighting silly circuit, which is basically a square with not many proper corners, and it does require incredible accuracy in terms of high-speed braking and the way you hit curbs, all the things that Charles was finding difficult with the deployment management that he was trying to get on top of. But in the race, again, he had a little bit of a rhythm, wasn't too bad. But by then, obviously, we know he'd switched to the carbon industry, brake friction materials. And we came to Silverstone, and he did a very good job of mixing and matching, mixing Lewis's, and I wouldn't agree with your adjective of aggressive braking. All Lewis is doing is braking more in a straight line than Charles Leclerc. And because he's braking more in a straight line, he's able more efficiently to harvest the energy that he needs through the rear axle, and he can then deploy it more efficiently around the lap, wherever it requires braking, heavy braking. And he's doing a very good job with that. And what Charles needed to do was exactly that, but then still retain some of the things that Charles Leclerc, have always done a little bit better than Lewis Hamilton, in his opinion. And that obviously manifested itself for many years in his ability to create short corners like Max Verstappen, to shorten the corner, lengthen the straight in, lengthen the straight out. But in this situation, when he wasn't able to do that because it was going to hurt the way he harvested the power, the only thing he could do is drive like Lewis, but do it a little bit softer and a little bit lighter, and just be a little bit better with these transitions when he does start to turn in. And that's exactly what he did at Silverstone. He worked it out. And what we saw at Silverstone was a new Charles Leclerc. He's not turning in particularly early, but he's doing everything Lewis does, but a little bit more fine touch. Whereas Lewis these days is just leaning on the rear a little bit more than he used to, in my opinion, when he used to really turn in early. And if you look at, there are quite a lot of shots we saw on TV and still shots you see of Lewis, he's got almost sort of neutral drift going into some of the slower corners. He's leaning on the rear quite a lot, where Charles was never leaning on the rear at Silverstone. And that was the difference. And when they got to the really fast Beckett section, Charles was just like dancing like that. And Lewis was always, there's a little bit more load going through the car. And that was the difference. And Charles has done exactly what I think. He just complicated it, and I think he still is complicating it by going to the carbon industry friction material. I think he should go back to Brembo, and I think you'll find he'll be just as quick now as he was before. probably quicker, because he'll have a better feel for the brake pedal that he's known and loved for so many years.
It's
I think he just put too many things together after Monaco.
You know, Peter, it's very interesting. Had you asked me at the start of the year whether Lewis was going to beat Charles around Austria and then Charles beat Lewis around Silverstone, I would have asked you what you were smoking. It just sounds incredible. But again, it is that type of topsy-turvy season, isn't it? I would have been keen to see how Lewis would have performed, but for the cheeky oversteer moments at Luffield in qualifying. Had he put it on P1, would he have gone and made that mistake off the line? Would he have? It's interesting when Lewis gets a sniff. He's a different.
Well, what was that mistake? It was an interesting mistake, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because you do see the thing move slightly, but interestingly, most drivers in the past who have made a mistake like that, let's say he's released the clutch just a fraction, or maybe released the brake pedal just a fraction, usually they then overreact and brake more, or go back with the clutch, and then they make a terrible start. But Lewis actually makes a great start. Despite that, with unbelievable reflexes. And maybe even from his point of view, he didn't actually feel it. I'm sure he did, but it was very, very slight, wasn't it?
It was slight.
But the problem is photographic evidence is a lot more reliable than F1 timing loops these days. So,
which is interesting, Peter, because I remember a couple of years ago when Lando Norris and Checo Perez made full starts, the transponders weren't working, and then they did one of these, didn't they? And no harm, no foul. Didn't see it then, which is interesting. But again, the FIA being, I mean, it's Hanlon's razor, is it? Or never chalk up to malice that which you can attribute to stupidity. Yeah. Let me introduce you to my friend, the FIA.